Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
The Olympic Peninsula of Washington State is a wild and woolly place, even now in the 21st century. That's no doubt largely because the heart of the peninsula is taken up by Olympic National Park, a more than 900,000-acre jigsaw puzzle of glaciers and peaks, rainforests, rivers, and Pacific coastline. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. I've often viewed Olympic National Park as three parks in one: the coastal area battered by the Pacific Ocean, the inland rainforests that cloak the Hoh, Quinault, and Sol Duc areas, and the high, craggy landscape embracing nearly 200 glaciers. If you've never visited the park, or have only experienced it once for a few days, our guest on today's show will no doubt make you want to start planning for a trip to Olympic National Park in the Olympic Peninsula. Tim McNulty is a prolific writer who lives in the shadow of the national park. He has a new book out, Salmon, Cedar, Rock and Rain, that is the perfect introduction on this ecosystem of not just the national park, but of the surrounding Olympic Peninsula. We'll be back in a minute with Tim.
Maximize your savings with Interior Federal Credit Union. Explore the benefits of opening multiple certificates to diversify your savings strategy. Discover how Interior FCU's range of certificate options can help you achieve your financial goals with competitive rates and flexible terms. Learn more at interiorfcu.org. Federally insured by NCUA. The Grand Teton National Park Foundation is a private, nonprofit organization that supports projects that protect and enhance Grand Teton National Park's cultural, historic, and natural resources. By funding initiatives that go beyond what the National Park Service could accomplish on its own, Foundation donors improve the visitor experience and provide benefits to the national park system for decades to come. You can see their successes at gtnpf.org. Whether it be strategy, business planning, change management, board development, executive search, or diversity planning, Potrero Group is here to help. They mix a depth of experience in the parks and land space with a breadth of best practices from other industries. For more information or to schedule a preliminary conversation, go to potrerogroup.com, Potrero group.com.
Hey Tim, great to have you on The Traveler.
Wonderful to be here, Kurt.
So you live in an incredible place. I've visited it a couple times, the Olympic Peninsula, and wish I were a little bit closer because it's a long drive from Utah. It's a fascinating backyard. I mean, the mountains, the coast, the rainforests. How did you end up there?
Well, I was, I guess, a young fellow just out of college on the East Coast. Had been filling my head with West Coast poetry during my last few years in colleges, and was looking for a wonderful place to go get inspired and write and see what became of it. And in my travels around the West, from the Rockies down into the Southwest, up the coastal areas, the Cascades, the Olympics, and on into Canada, the Olympic Peninsula was the place that just stole my heart away. It had, mountains, wild rivers, incredible old growth forest, a long stretch of undeveloped wild coastline. It was just everything I loved about New England, kind of on steroids. It was wild. It was a pretty cheap place to live, and I thought I would just stay here and give it a try and see what happened.
A lot of rain there from time to time, no?
Yeah. Let's see. Mount Olympus gets about 240 inches a year. The rainforest just below it at Hoh, about 160. We're in the rain shadow. The backbone little sub-range of the Olympics, the Bailey Range, holds back a fair amount of moisture. So over here in the Dungeness watershed in the rain shadow, we get about 30 inches here. Down in the valley, it's closer to 14. So it's really one of the steepest precipitation gradients in the world, going from a couple hundred inches and more on the Bailey Range down to less than 20, 35 miles away. And that kind of rainfall diversity really helps with this incredible biological diversity of the Olympic Peninsula and the park.
That really is an amazing amount of precipitation. I mean, I've lived in Wyoming and Utah for the past, almost 4 decades, and it's a little drier here.
A little bit. Yeah, it's a little drier most everywhere than the west side of the peninsula.
For sure, for sure. Now, as I mentioned in the introduction to today's show, you are a prolific writer. You have at least 10 books to your credit, not to mention your poetry. You've won a National Outdoor Book Award, and you're also currently the vice president of Olympic Park Advocates. No shortage of material for you to mold and play with out there. I'm just wondering how you find the time to do it.
I kind of lucked out with this place. I didn't intend to be drawn into environmental conservation work when I first landed, but one of the very first places I fell in love with was a northern stretch of coast, a beach called Shai Shai, Point of the Arches, Shai Shai
Sure.
Beach. At that time, it was owned by a number of timber companies, and the clear cuts were kind of marching inland out toward the coast. So I found another fellow soul who was already involved in writing letters to try to get that place preserved, and I started as well. Pretty soon met some of the legendary old conservationists over in Seattle, Polly Dyer and Phil Zaleski and many others, Harvey Manning, and kind of got recruited into the ongoing citizens effort to save and protect as much of the Olympics, the Wild Olympics, as possible. Been doing that ever since.
Yeah, and the battles never end, do they? I mean, there's a long history of headbutting over the Olympic Peninsula and about the Olympic forests. I mean, I think you can go back to John Muir and the first chief of the Gifford.
Right. Yeah, Karsten Lean wrote a splendid book on the historic battle to create Olympic National Park, and then the battle to keep it wild and forested. Olympic battleground, he called it, and he traces that battle and all the way back to in 1897 the Olympic Forest Reserve was created by along with all of the early western forest preserves, and it was 2.2 million acres of lands. And then of course the issue was between Gifford Pinchot utilization and John Muir preservation. Sure. And within a decade, 750,000 acres, some of the most incredibly rich, productive, low elevation, old growth forest lands were removed from the monument, open to settlement. Settlement, of course, ended up in the hands of timber companies, and all those lands were very soon logged after that. And the battle continues.
It does. I'm curious, though, with the precipitation out there and the fertile soils out there, how long does it take a logged area to, I mean, certainly not recover to, trees hundreds of years old, but to start to look like a forest again?
Well, that's an interesting question. And when areas are logged as they were then and left alone, it was kind of a sloppy clear cutting where trees that were crooked, trees that were hard to get, trees that were in ravines and so forth were left, and then often it burned after that, and trees seeded back in from native forests, and the second growth forests that came in a while ago, say before the Second World War, had a lot of diversity in them. A lot of diversity of species and ages, and those forests are now approaching a century or more, and they're well on their way to old growth. They have a lot of the characteristics, habitat characteristics, and structural characteristics of old growth. And they're pretty valuable forests, we're finding. They're incredibly important for carbon storage, as well as habitat, stream protection, salmon habitat. And those forests are now looked at as quite valuable. To get to a true old growth forest, we're talking 150 to 250 to 300 years, where all of the characteristics of old growth, standing snags and down logs and diversity of understory and overstory openings and so forth, all the things that make forests rich and great habitats for species like spotted owls and marbled murrelets. Those forests do take a while. But a logged over and planted clear cut begins to start to resemble the forest again in about 45 to 60 years.
Yeah, I'm curious. We're going to get into climate change a little bit down the road here, but with that change in forest diversity, does it make it more prone to burning?
Diversity and structural diversity is a good thing for fire control. Fires that are more prone to burn are generally younger forests. When forests are planted with Douglas firs, they grow up dense. For the first several decades, there's ladder fuels, lower branches going all the way up to the crown, and no breaks, no gaps. And fires tend to move through younger forests much more quickly and thoroughly than they do with older forests.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. Now, probably the book that introduced me to you and helped me learn a lot about the Olympic National Park was your 1996 title, Olympic National Park, A Natural History. I still have it in my bookcase. I refer to it often when I'm writing about Olympic National Park. At the time, at least, if not today, it served as a consummate natural history guide to the national park, which makes me wonder what spurred your current book, Salmon, Cedar, Rock, and Rain. How did that title come about?
Salmon, Cedar, Rock, and Rain was a collaborative project. One of the very popular outdoor publishers over here, you probably know, are the Mountaineers books. And they have an imprint called Braided River. And the Braided River publishers do primarily large format, full color books with a conservation orientation. And they did a book on the North Cascades some years ago, and it had been in discussion among the editors and publisher that it'd be good to do an Olympics book. And so I went to a meeting some years ago with some of the Braided River folks, the writer Nautilus David Gudertson, who was also interested in a book on the Olympics, and we all started talking about the possibility of a project. One of the things that we all agreed upon early on was there should be some Native American voices in any book on the Olympic Peninsula, and photographs from a range of different photographers. And so that became kind of the operating principle for a newer book that would go beyond just Olympic National Park, but talk about the entire peninsula, the tribes, the different agencies doing different kinds of work on the peninsula, as well as the Park Service, Forest Service, wilderness areas, rivers, and so forth.
Yeah, interesting.
I felt that this one would be a complement to to the natural history, which is in its fourth edition now, still in print, and would also be a little bit easier and prettier way to get into appreciating the peninsula, perhaps appeal to a wider and more diverse audience.
Yeah, we're gonna get into that prettier side as well. This is Kurt Repenchek with National Parks Traveler. Our guest today is Tim McNulty. He's got a new book out, Salmon, Cedar, Rock, and Rain, Washington's Olympic Peninsula. We're going to take a short break and we'll be right back.
Listener and reader support make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org. Washington State is graced with 3 spectacular national parks, each different and special in their own unique ways. As the official nonprofit partner and the only philanthropic organization dedicated exclusively to supporting these parks through charitable contributions, Washington's National Park Fund has a mission to raise private support to deepen everyone's love for, understanding of, and experiences in Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. Share your passion for these parks at WNPF.org. Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life is a biannual magazine produced by Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokiesinformation.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org.
So, Tim, as you mentioned before the break, your new book is a rich, robust project. It's heavily illustrated with some incredible photos. The one on page 123 that depicts a rather large and red-colored Pacific octopus with a scuba diver, that really grabbed my attention.
Mine as well. Mine too.
The editorial content, as you mentioned, is a collaboration of sorts with a number of indigenous writers. Why were they brought into the project? Can you go into that a little bit more deeply?
Well, sure. With much of my writing and some of the other writers who write about the park, our focus is the non-human community. And in my natural history, you may recall that there was a couple of chapters of human history. One was the conservation history, and another was just kind of a rough introduction to the diversity of tribal people who have lived on the peninsula since time immemorial. And so I think we all felt that was an important part of the story here. They were the original stewards of this land. The tribes continue to protect resources, work toward restoration. In some instances, are very, very, very large parts of the community. In the community that I live, there's a large health facility that's developed and sponsored by the tribe, a large environmental education facility as well. And so we felt that if we were going to tell the story about the peninsula, then that important part of the story needed to be at the forefront.
You know, it's interesting. As I mentioned, I've been in the West and the Southwest for going on 40 years, and certainly there's a lot of indigenous cultures here in the West, in the Rocky Mountains, the Intermountain West, and they take up a rather large span, each whether it's the Lakota Sioux or the Apache down in Arizona, and yet you look at the Olympic Peninsula, and there are, I believe, 8 sovereign tribes there, and it's like a pie of sorts. They each have their own section, judging from the map in the book. That kind of surprised me, as opposed to one indigenous people.
Well, part of that is a result of the treaty process in the 1850s. While Washington was still a territory, one of the first priorities of the territorial government was to establish treaties with the tribes, and they met with different tribes, different language groups around the peninsula, and had a number of treaties. The villages, which were primarily at river mouths and stream mouths, the winter villages were just a vast diversity of languages and people, and once the tribes were recognized through treaty rights, then that kind of helped define the way our government deals with tribal governments.
Were the tribes open to the lands they were given? And I'm thinking about in Wyoming with the Arapaho and the Eastern Shoshone, they were not exactly friendly. If you go back, they had different points of view, and here they found themselves on the same reservation. Was that the case at the Olympic Peninsula, or they all pretty much got along?
Well, I think there was generally the tribes traded quite a bit, intermarried. There was certainly some skirmishes and warfare as well, but the orientation, rather than the land, such as the Plains or Southwest tribes, was the waters, the rivers, the ocean, the intertidal areas, and when the treaties were formed here, the tribes had a much more important stake in maintaining their hunting and fishing areas, hunting and fishing rights in the treaties, rather than large land claims. And the whole concept of ownership was, I think, something that was pretty foreign to tribal people most everywhere at the time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And now, as you mentioned, they're doing a lot of work, or they have been doing a lot of work with restoration areas. I know I worked on a freelance story about a year or so ago, and I can't remember which tribe it was, but they were working quite heavily with beavers to help restore watershed.
Well, of course, the Elwha restoration, largest salmon restoration in the Northwest, was primarily driven by the Elwha tribe. The other tribes are all engaged in primarily salmon and salmon habitat restoration projects, where dikes that were put up so that floodplains could be farmed are now being moved away from the river to give rivers more room to breathe, and more spawning and rearing areas for the salmon to breathe during floods. I mean. Log jams engineered log jams are being put back, where we took away all of the wood and important structural materials in the river that created pools and riffles that were important for salmon, for spawning, for hiding, for rearing areas. And I'd say that the tribes have been really leading the way toward the major habitat restoration underway on the peninsula and throughout the Pacific Northwest today.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the national park makes up a big chunk of the peninsula. Of course, you also have the Olympic National Forest there. As you point out in your book, that peninsula long ago was an island. Did that fact lend anything to the evolution of its ecosystems?
You know, it had almost everything to do with the evolution of the ecosystems here, Kurt. It's a great question. If we go back to the Pleistocene Ice Age, the last couple of million years, say, at least 4 times the large Cordilleran ice sheet moved down from the north, ran up against the peninsula, and pretty much surrounded the peninsula. I'm looking out my window out here at Blue Mountain. At the 4,000-foot mark, that's about where the ice hit that mountain. And so one big lobe of the ice sheet stretched west, and that's what carved the Strait of Juan de Fuca, the body of water between the peninsula and Vancouver Island. Another lobe stretched south around the Olympics and plowed out Puget Sound, which separates us, of course, from Seattle and I-5 and the big populated part of Washington State. And so for extended periods, the animals and plants that lived in the Olympic Mountains were on an island. It was sheer ice to the north and mostly the east. There was a big dip where the Chehalis River and the meltwaters from the Puget Sound lobe flowed out on the south part of the Olympics. And many species which were just cut off from their families continued to survive on the Olympics. Many became endemic species. I think there's a total of about 28 plants and animals and fish and amphibians that occur in the Olympics and nowhere else. The most popular, of course, being the Olympic marmot, who's the kind of the hero of the high country. But there are also other small mammals and, as I mentioned, fish and amphibians and plants.
Yeah, you kind of answered my next question. In the book, you mentioned that the national park is one of the most ecologically diverse parks in the nation, in the national park system. How diverse is that?
Well, I think, if you figure on the ocean and the sea mammal migrations and the intertidal zone, that alone is a pretty wild and stunningly diverse landscape. Here in the Olympics, the California coastal biome and the northern Alaskan communities kind of intersect, they merge here, and so we have just species from both south and north. both intertidal and sea mammal species. And then the inland forests, the old growth forests of the temperate rainforests of the west side and the drier Douglas fir forests of the east side of the peninsula, which have more in common with the continental forests of the Rockies than they do with some of the rainforests, Sitka spruce rainforests. And, the elk populations and all of the surrounding animals in the forest component, and then the subalpine and alpine areas, which have a lot of these endemic species that I talked about, and also the rivers and their salmon populations. And so when you stir that all together into a single ecosystem, it's phenomenal diversity. I think any component of that would serve well as a national park. And yet it's all contained in a pretty small, you said a little under 1 million acres area of Olympic National Park. And of course, it's surrounding wildlands managed by other agencies, Forest Service, state, private, tribal, etc.
Yeah. Now, some years ago, it kind of gained fame with the quietest inch in America, and I probably got that wrong. But basically, that's what they called it.
1 square inch of silence.
Yeah.
Gordon Hempton developed that, and it's a lovely little place up the Hoh Valley. That he's a sound expert, sound recording expert who has been around the world recording different sounds and silence, and natural sounds is, I think, his strong point, his emphasis. And you can hear the rain on the leaves, and you can hear a little bit of the river through the woods, and occasional songbirds. But it is one of the quietest spots in the world. Of course, we have also a Navy jet base nearby,
right.
And they're training their Growler jets out over the coastline and occasionally skirting the mountains. And so it's not as quiet as it could be, and that's an issue that many organizations out here on the peninsula have been working on, trying to fight and get a handle on for some years now. Yeah,
I think it's an issue the travelers should take another look at, because I do remember writing about it and that issue with the Navy training and the noise it was bringing into the national park. And
our Attorney General here in Washington State brought suit against the Navy because they had exceeded what was allowed, what they had described in their environmental impact statement. The judge agreed with all the points of the challenge, but said, "Sorry, this is national security, and the Navy gets to do it anyway." Have to redo their EIS, but they can still continue to increase their jet training, Growler jet training here.
Yeah. It sounds like there's a case out in Cumberland Island National Seashore in Georgia, and a lawsuit brought against the Park Service over the management of feral horses there on the National Seashore. And one of the things the Department of Justice said in trying to have the suit dismissed was, "Well, we didn't give you the okay to sue us." So
that's a novel defense.
It is a novel defense. This is Kurt Repenchek with National Parks Traveler. We're talking today with Tim McNulty about his latest book project, Salmon, Cedar, Rock, and Rain, Washington's Olympic Peninsula. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back.
The Yosemite Conservancy helps visitors connect with Yosemite through adventures, volunteering, and the arts. It's the only nonprofit dedicated to supporting Yosemite National Park and funds grants to improve trails, restore habitat, protect wildlife, and inspire the next generation of nature lovers. Learn more at yosemite.org. The Everglades Foundation, the only organization whose sole mission is to restore and protect America's Everglades. Learn more at evergladesfoundation.org. Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It's also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org.
So, Tim, as we mentioned earlier, the park has had its share of controversy. As you noted, Karsten Lean recounted battles over the peninsula's forests in Olympic Battleground, a fine, thick book. If you really want to learn about the history of the Forest Service and the National Park Service and John Muir and Gifford Pinchot, it's a great one to start with. He did a heck of a lot of research with that. You also cited Embattled Wilderness. There are ever-increasing crowds of visitors that impact the natural resources of the peninsula. Of course, the non-native mountain goats have been in the news in recent years. And climate change, of course, which is taking a toll on the park's glaciers. In preparing for our conversation today, I tried to find out exactly how many glaciers there are today in Glacier National Park, and the best I could come up with was, well, almost 200, and I'm guessing it's probably closer to 150.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Glacier National Park. Did you mean Olympic?
I was talking about glaciers, but I might have mentioned Glacier National Park instead of Olympic National Park. But now that I mention it, do you know how many glaciers are in Glacier National Park?
They're a little under 200, but some of them are very, very, very small ice. Just little ice fields.
Sure.
And it looks like we've lost almost a third of those. Since an initial survey was done in the 80s, they've either totally disappeared, like the Anderson Glacier, the Ferry Glacier, or they've shrunk to the point where they're remnant ice fields no longer kind of functioning as glaciers. And the large glaciers of Mount Olympus, the Eel Glacier, the Blue Glacier, I'm sorry, the Blue Glacier, the White Glacier, the Eel Glacier on Mount Anderson. Two of those glaciers are being studied as part of a long-term glacier study project where they're going in the spring and setting up stakes, going back in the fall, taking measurements, measuring how fast the glaciers are moving, how quickly they're receding, year by year data sets that are showing all of the glaciers really taking a strong hit from global warming. And that work is ongoing now in both Olympic, Mount Rainier, and North Cascades National Parks. John Radel who worked for North Cascades for many years, is directing that study. And the Olympic glaciers are going faster than the other ones because they're lower elevations, of course, than Mount Rainier or the North Cascades. They're here because we had such a tremendous amount of precipitation. But now, with that precipitation falling more and more as rain rather than snow, the glaciers are really taking a hit. The south-facing glaciers particularly are disappearing, and I've seen that just in my time here in the 50 years I've been roaming around the Olympics. Glaciers that I've roped up to climb on Mount Anderson, the Eel Glacier, and are just gone.
Yeah, it's really kind of sad. I mean, my wife and I were up in Grand Teton National Park back in August, and Skillet Glacier on Mount Moran, one of the most famous glaciers because it's so visible, is really kind of vanishing before your eyes. There's some interesting things with vanishing glaciers. I mean, one, we're seeing more and more stories of the artifacts that they reveal, the archaeological artifacts that they reveal. And of course, there's the concern over when the glaciers are gone, they take a water source with them.
They do, and here in the Olympics, a lot of the rivers have glaciers in the headwaters. So the big West End rivers, the Hoh, the Queets, the Quinault, are glacial-fed rivers, and they're very, very important salmon streams. And so that's a concern with not only a lesser source of the rivers, but warming temperatures. So that icy water coming off the glaciers is as cold as water gets, and it's a great help to fish, to native fish. There is as well as over more on the northern and eastern flanks of the Olympics, snowmelt glaciers, snowmelt rivers rather, glacier rivers that do not have glacial sources. The Dungeness River that we live near is a river like that, and those rivers are wholly dependent on the winter snowpack in the mountains. That's our equivalent of the reservoirs here. Is
Sure.
these snow that used to be pretty much, pretty solid above 2,500, 3,000 feet. Winters now where we get big warm rainstorms coming in November, December, and the snowpack diminishes up to say 4,000 or 5,000 feet. 2015 was a kind of a benchmark year. It was a drought year with a very, very warm winter, and it reached the kind of conditions in the Olympics that the climate scientists over at the University of Washington were projecting for 2040, 2050. And so it kind of gave us a little bit of a glimpse of what's in store if climate change, if global warming continues apace. And that's the year that famously the Quinault rainforest burned, an area that gets well over 150 inches of rain. And so it's pretty frightening.
Yeah, it directly impacts half of the title of your book, the salmon fisheries, and of course the cedar forests. Any predictions?
I think a lot of people are doing everything they can to try to turn this around somewhat or slow the pace of global warming. One of the main issues that came up on the peninsula, I'd say just in the last 5 or 6 years, is those natural second growth forests that I was telling you about earlier. What we're calling the legacy forests. Forests that were logged and then just came back on their own and have a lot of diversity, some big trees, occasionally some very big trees, are very, very important for carbon sequestration, for absorbing carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it in the trees, in the roots, in the soil. And so we're trying to work to get the State Department of Natural Resources that manages a lot of the second growth forests at lower elevation to kind of back off on logging those legacy forests and use those forests for the much more important work that they do, storing carbon rather than providing fiber for the mills.
Yeah. But how do you replenish the moisture that is captured by the snowfields and the glacier? I mean, when they're gone, what does that mean for the fisheries in all the rivers that course through the Olympic Peninsula?
Yeah, well, it's hard to say, and no one really knows, Kurt. It's a very troubling question. In the meantime, I think the different agencies, primarily the tribes, also the State Department of Fish and Wildlife, are trying to work with restoring the natural functions of rivers so that they could provide the best possible salmon habitat they can, facing this unknown of what's going to happen with a lesser snowpack and much reduced glaciers. And so restoring ecosystems, restoring river watershed ecosystems to the best point possible so that they may be in their best condition to deal with, to provide habitat, to encourage the survival of salmon in the face of reducing snowpack is the main effort underway now. And of course, trying to restore threatened species of salmon runs. There's 5 that are listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, and there are recovery plans for all of those fish, and all of the agencies and the tribes are working on that.
Yeah. Now, against that backdrop of doom and gloom, you write in your new book that the ecosystem that holds up the peninsula and the national park is remarkably resilient. How do you mean that? I mean, after we were just talking about a loss of glaciers and possible impacts on the rivers and fisheries.
I'm going back to that topic we were talking about a little earlier, the Ice Age, and so if you'll recall, the Northern Peninsula, the Eastern Peninsula, was totally buried by a 4,000-foot ice sheet. It was then scraped raw, pretty much, as those ice sheets retreated. Following the ice age was a warming era, a warming time they call the hypsothermal, where it became Mediterranean-like conditions on the Olympic Peninsula.
Hmm.
And yet, and then following that, of course, the climate kind of stabilized. We're saying about maybe 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. The closed canopy forests we know today came back. But even within that time, there was a little ice age. There were warming epochs. Species moved around. Some species came up from California. All those rivers that were absolutely scoured and washed out by the ice age all became filled with native fish stocks. And so the genetic endurance of the peninsula, which goes back through the 2 million years of the ice age, has seen us through some pretty remarkable and catastrophic change. And that's kind of true for most of the Northwest forests, which experienced, volcanic eruptions, glacier advances, epic fire episodes, that these forests, these ecosystems are resilient. And here on the Olympic Peninsula, because of the park, because of the wild areas of the national forest, a good core of that ecosystem was preserved, which I think is going to be extremely important in helping us through the coming changes. So I do have faith that the ecosystem will make it in some form. And I think the important work we do now is to try to, as Aldo Leopold said, make sure all the cogs and wheels are still here, return extirpated species like the wolf, get rid of invasive species that were damaging the ecosystem like the mountain goats, and do all we can to restore ecological process and healthy habitats.
What concerns you most about the future of the peninsula and the national park, the ecosystems?
Well, I think probably no surprise from our discussion. It's the onslaught of global warming. It's something that I think none of us ever really imagined, even 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And it's now when I talk to scientists, it is the foremost concern on their parts. And it's not only a concern here; it's a concern of the entire world. I'd say, particularly here with human communities, the tribes, which of course are all coastal tribes, they're all living with the threat of rising sea level, flooding rivers, and so it's the climate aspect, the climate change aspect, is in a realm of its own. Beyond that, I think my other concern would be preserving a healthy genetic base of the forests, of the wildlife communities, to try to resemble what was here originally, that has gone through those profound changes of the past, so they might be able to carry the place through the profound changes there to come.
Conversely, what makes you most optimistic? I mean, and there's more than a few things I'm sure you can point to, whether it's the watershed scale restorations or.
Absolutely that, but I think that as was with me, this place just reached out and touched my heart, and I think it does that with millions and millions of people. We have Olympic National Park visitation. You probably know, 2.5 million a year. There's the people who live here year round, the people who pass through. It's a place that the world cares for. It's a biological, or rather, a World Heritage Site, a biosphere reserve. And I think that any time that a specific problem, a challenge arises, I've always been incredibly impressed with how many people from outside this area become involved, and help lead the Park Service to make good decisions. The Native American people, the tribal people who live on the peninsula, are continually working to protect and defend natural resources, and they're a very important, powerful, and influential voice in political decisions as well. So I think we're what gives me the most hope is that the power of this place to find voices in people that would be advocating for it.
Well, Tim, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today about your new book, Salmon, Cedar, Rock, and Rain. And I hope the listeners out there take to heart what I said early on in the introduction, that pick up this book and it'll give you more than a few reasons to go back and visit the Olympic National Peninsula if you haven't been there, Olympic Peninsula, if you haven't been there, in the national park and the surrounding national forest, because it really is an incredible place with all the life and diversity and ecosystems that exist there.
Well, thank you, Kurt. It's been a pleasure. You asked some great provocative questions, and I hope I rose to the occasion.
That's our show for this week. We hope you enjoyed it. The Olympic Peninsula and its ecosystems truly are a magnificent collection of natural spaces that you should include on your travels. Thanks to Tim McNulty, his fellow contributing writers and photographers, and the folks at Braided River Press for focusing their attention on this peninsula. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.